Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to the letter W in my alphabet of favourite films. As always, please leave your list of your favourite films beginning with W, because I always look forward to reading them. First of all, I'm going to start with two that I don't have boxes for. The first one is Winter Light from Ingmar Bergman, which is obviously in the Bergman box. The latest episode of Ronin Nazarin Talks should be up very soon, and Winter Light is featured in that chat as we continue our look through the Bergman box. And the other film, which I can't seem to put my hands on at the moment, is White God, a Hungarian film from 2014 about a teenage girl and her dog, but it's not a Disney film. It's quite brutal in places. It was one of my earliest videos, one of my earliest random reviews. It's one of the best films of the last 20 years. Obviously, I'm not a huge aficionado of modern films, but White God is just fantastic. I'm currently kind of rearranging my A to Z Blu-rays, and I think it's lost in the pile somewhere. I'm hoping to redecorate and get more bookshelves and more presentation shelves from a Blu-ray collection, so it's mixed in somewhere and I can't actually put my hands on it. So that's the two I'm going to mention before I forget, because they're on the list but I don't have them physically. So again, these are in no particular order. Some of them aren't going to make the magical, mythical, final 150 list, but they're well worth your time for various reasons, which I'll hopefully explain as we go. The first one is a Korean film from 1992 called White Badge. I'd like to thank A Touch of Film because he recommended this film. This is from the Korean Film Archive. It's a beautiful edition. This was directed by Jae Young Chung. Again, I apologise for Korean pronunciations. And this is actually a little story about Korean soldiers in Vietnam, which is a kind of story that in the West we're perhaps not as familiar with. I would say it's maybe about 15 minutes too long. It kind of jumps backwards and forwards. One of the soldiers comes back and he's a reporter and he's kind of going to write about his experiences, but he doesn't really want to, and it kind of flashes backwards to the war and his experiences in the war. And there's also another one of his ex-soldiers that he meets who's having a bit of trouble with post-traumatic stress. Like I said, it's probably 15 minutes too long, but the print is fantastic. The Korean Film Archive have done a really good job on the restoration, and it's actually quite moving in the end. Next is Wrist Cutters. This is a lovely little indie film from 2006. It stars lots of independent actors that you might not know the name of, but you recognise the face. It's Patrick Fugit, who was in Cameron Crowe's wonderful Almost Famous. Shannon Sossamon, Shea Wiggum, John Hawkes, who again you'll recognise these people's faces, but perhaps not the name. And it's got a fantastic turn by Tom Waits, so I don't need an excuse to watch a Tom Waits film. This is about a kind of limbo state where people who commit suicide go. So they're all a little bit paler. We follow Patrick Fugit as he's trying to find his girlfriend, because he finds out that she killed herself like a month after he killed himself. But as we find out, it might not be for the reasons that he thinks. And he kind of crosses paths with Shea Whigham. It's a bit of a road movie. It's kind of quintessential indie film, and if you know what that means. Again, it's not perfect, but there's so much fun to be had if you are a fan of kind of independent character actors, no stars, just talent. Yeah, it's a really enjoyable little black comedy, and again, Tom Waits is in it. You don't need another excuse because Tom Waits is in it. Next is Wildlike with Bruce Greenwood. Bruce Greenwood for me is a really underrated actor, and he stars in this as a guy who's out hiking, and he comes across this girl who has a history and a past, and she latches onto him as they go across country. Again, it's another kind of road movie. Again, another independent film, a small film, but it's beautifully acted, and I really do need to upgrade to Blu-ray on it. Really beautiful scenery and a couple of really nice turns. Next is The World of Apu, or Apu Sansa. I suppose this really should have been in my A list, but I'm putting it in the W list. This is the final part of Satyajit Ray's Apu trilogy. This is Apu grown up, and it's quite fantastic and a fitting kind of final part to the trilogy, as we've grown up with Apu, and we've known his family. It's a wonderful film. It's from 1959. We made the 3 Apu films over the space of 4 years. Next is a Francois Truffaut film, The Woman Next Door, with the wonderful Fanny Ardant and Gerard Depardieu, and it's strangely enough about an affair that Gerard Depardieu has with the woman next door, played by Fanny Ardant. It's certainly not as much fun as the other Truffaut Ardant film, Finally Sunday, which is just an absolute blast with Jean-Louis Trintignant. But The Woman Next Door is a nice little drama. Next is we need to talk about Kevin with Lynn Ramsay, which has an amazing turn by Tilda Swinton and John C. Reilly as her kind of husband that doesn't really have any awareness of what's going on, and a fairly disturbing performance by Ezra Miller, who has went on to play other disturbed individuals. Again, it messes about with chronology. It flashes backwards and forwards between time periods, and it's a stunningly good film. This is from 2011, so another relatively modern film that's actually good. Next is WALL-E, which is slightly different. One of Pixar's best. For large parts of the film, it's almost a silent film, which is amazing that audiences would actually sit for that these days. But it's just a wonderful film. It's got an ecological message and vibe without being too preachy. And it's a wonderful performance by the robots involved. Next is Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, one of the seminal late westerns. Of course, it's a bit overlong, but you have to remember Peckinpah was drunk for most of the shooting. So it's amazing that it's fairly coherent. Obviously has a big bloody shootout at the end. It has one of cinema's finest walks as William Holden, etc. walk up to their eventual death, and they know that they're going to their death. William Holden has a great look at Warren Oates, and Warren Oates knows exactly what he's talking about without actually saying a word. And they do go on one of the great cinematic walks up the hill towards their doom. Next is Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Strangely enough, not called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which I believe the book called. This is a great little musical, but has a dark undercurrent. Gene Wilder was not going to play Willy Wonka unless he could play it with a little bit of darkness, a little bit of mystery. And he gives a wonderful performance. The kind of boat ride through the tunnel when it goes all a little bit disturbing, even inspired Marilyn Manson to cover the song almost in one of his earlier songs. Classic Gene Wilder performance. Next is Winchester 73 with Jimmy Stewart and Dan Duryea and Shelley Winters. One of Jimmy Stewart's Anthony Mann westerns. This is one of the black and white ones, and it's literally fairly linear about a man tracking down his stolen Winchester 73 rifle. Great film. Perhaps not my favourite Anthony Mann Jimmy Stewart collaboration, but certainly well worth your time. Next is The Wizard of Oz. Probably not going to make the final list, but it's such an important and surprising film, even though it took a lot of years for it actually to get appreciated. I don't think people kind of understood what was happening most of the time during it. And the switch from black and white to colour is still one of those fairly amazing cinematic moments, unless of course you first watched it on a black and white television and it didn't make any difference. Next is the first Wolfman Universal film with Lon Chaney Jr. The reason it's so good is because Lon Chaney plays it as a genuinely cursed hero, weighed down by not only his father Claude Rains in the film, but Lon Chaney Sr. for Lon Chaney Jr. And you really get a sense of a man cursed in one way or another. Next is Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire, which is quite beautiful. One of Bruno Gantz's finest performances. Peter Falk turns up as himself. Perhaps a little overrated, but still really good. Next is, I almost call him Wiki Takiki, Takiki Watiti. That's still not his name. What We Do in the Shadows, which only recently I realised they actually made a TV show as well, starring Matt Berry, which is a lot of fun too. It's essentially Spinal Tap, but with New Zealand vampires. It's perhaps not on the level of Spinal Tap, but the characters are great, and it does feature the kind of 4 different kind of stereotypical types of vampire. the dandy, the goth, the Nosferatu character, and the kind of rebel. You know when I was saying I couldn't find White God even? There's White God, the film I was talking about earlier that I couldn't find. I had already put it in the pile. It's Sunday. Yeah, an amazing Hungarian film about a girl and her dog, but it's not Disney. There is some tough moments as her dog is lost and gets involved in a dog fighting ring, amongst other things. No animals were harmed in the making of the film, but it is brutal at times. It has a powerful message, and it is, like I said, it's 2014, and it is one of the best films of the millennium. But unfortunately, not a lot of people have actually seen it. But I do urge you to try and check it out if you can find it, because it's stunningly good. Next is Whip It, directed by Drew Barrymore, about an all-female roller skating crew. It's got every cliche in the book of sports movies, but it just works. It's a great cast, and it really shouldn't work, and it shouldn't be as good as it is, but it is. That makes any sense. Slight difference of tone. It's Went the Day Well, by Cavalcanti. It's an Ealing film, but certainly not a comedy. It's about a small English village who realise that there's Germans pretending to be English soldiers. There's a really dark undercurrent to it, of the idea of how normal people have to be turned into killers to actually stop the Germans. Thora Hird, who certainly in Britain, as she was older, she kind of got attached to songs of praise, and whereas in this she shoots lots of Germans. It's a really unusual film, but it's so good. Next is Watership Down, one of the toughest cartoons you're ever likely to watch. This is actually in Criterion, I believe. Really upset me as a child, and still is quite upsetting. Next is Wolfen with Albert Finney, which is, again, it's like an ecological werewolf film. It's about really shape-shifting. It's got a great cast: Gregory Hines, Tom Noonan, who would obviously become more famous in Michael Mann's Manhunter. Albert Finney, I mean, it's rough around the edges, but it does have some genuinely disturbing moments, and again, it's got a really nice idea of as the rich kind of feed on the poor from a socio-economical standpoint, the poor kind of feed on the rich by getting their own back on them in a certain werewolfy way. Next, another premium collection edition of Wait Until Dark, with Audrey Hepburn, Alan Arkin and Richard Crenna, before he became a parody of himself. He is actually genuinely creepy in this, as is Alan Arkin. It does have a fantastic jump scare. Audrey Hepburn is blind, and Alan Arkin and Richard Crenna play the hoodlums. It's really well done, even though it's a fairly simple setup. Next is one of the rare Alfred Hitchcock films I have, The Wrong Man, with Henry Fonda, pretty much because it's Henry Fonda. Granted, it is a bit ridiculous to suggest that Henry Fonda would be guilty of crime and therefore be the wrong man. Next you'll be telling me you'll like wipe out a family on a farm and blow a kid away. I mean, it's ridiculous. Next is another premium collection edition, Jimmy Cagney in White Heat, which for the time, which was 1949, I suppose 1949, I thought it was actually earlier than that. It's really kind of violent. One of the first, well, I don't know, I was going to say one of the first films to feature a psychopathic character in Jimmy Cagney, who's obviously got mummy issues, not in the Boris Karloff sense. Yeah, really violent for its time. And again, Jimmy Cagney in one of the great unhinged performances. Next are two war films from the 30s. So we have Wooden Crosses by Raymond Bernard, or La Croix de Bois, from 1932, which is a French look at World War One. And then we have West Front 1918 by G.W. Pabst from 1930. These are both Eureka Masters of Cinema releases. It's really funny, they're both, not funny at all, they're both similar films. They are both beautifully horrible or horribly beautiful. The trench warfare is brutal. The action sequences are way ahead of their time. I'm guessing Kubrick must have seen both these films, because you do see the influence on Paths of Glory. But what makes these well worth your time? Granted, they have the tropes of war films, as you know, while the guys are fighting in the trenches, their wives are having affairs with people. That trope's been used in films so often. And the scenes of the soldiers when they're away from the trenches don't work as well. The kind of, not slapstick humour, but kind of knockabout comedy and bits doesn't really work. But when they're at the trenches, showing the brutality and the pointlessness of it all is just, they're both wonderful. Again, there's a horrible poetry to it. There's like a beautiful scene in Wooden Crosses where one of the guys that's been killed gets a letter, so the other soldier goes to his grave that they've dug and kind of tears the letter up and drops it in the grave. Even the opening shot of Wooden Crosses, it's rows and rows of soldiers, and then it just dissolves and they're all painted white crosses. But what sets these apart, and it's almost unusual in comparison to later war films, is the fact that there's no jingoism, there's no flag waving, there's no demonising the enemy. Both films, one's French, one's German. Granted, Pabst was against fascism, but the enemy is just kind of, it's the enemy. They're mentioned, in one film it's the Germans, in another film it's the French. But in comparison to later war films, it's just, it kind of strikes you as weird and really refreshing that it's focusing on the inhumanity of war, the butchery, the slaughter that was World War One, and it's less about, aren't we great, and the flag waving and the jingoism that certainly appears in later war films by certain countries. Whereas these two films are more interested in the human cost rather than the larger political landscape. they're both kind of shot ahead of their time. Like I said, the action sequences, you keep having to remind yourself this was like 1930, this was 1932 these were shot. They're both films that are in that beautiful horrible category of, you know, it's dark subject matter, it's horrible subject matter, but they're just shot in a very poetic way. So they're both not perfect. Like I said, there's elements when away from the trenches that perhaps don't age very well, but at their core they're just wonderful anti-war films. Next on the list is Wild Strawberries, which obviously is in the Bergman box, but I do have it on individual Blu-ray because it's one of my favourite Bergmans, and certainly gets more relevant the older I get, and is certainly one of Bergman's most moving films. We recently, in Ronan Nazarin Talks on the channel, we did episode 1 of our Bergman with Wild Strawberries and Smiles of a Summer Night. So if you haven't seen that, you should check that out. Wild Strawberries is just fantastic. Again, a road movie. Next is Clouseau's Wages of Fear, another bleak misanthropic film by Clouseau. Again, simple story, guys, another road movie, strangely enough, taking explosive trucks across mountains and getting into various scrapes. Next is another film that I did a random review on, When the Wind Blows, which is a beautiful little animation about nuclear holocaust. Next is another Eureka release from Fritz Lang, The Woman in the Window, by Edward G. Robinson, with Edward G. Robinson and Joan Bennett. This is a lovely little film about the hubris of being older, and pretty much a lesson in don't ever get involved with strange women, even if it's just for one drink, because that can lead you down a path of murder and mystery and intrigue. Dan Duryea turns up, Raymond Massey. It's got a great cast. It's just really enjoyable. See, I haven't even mentioned the ending. Next is another Eureka release. This is just a coincidence. It's The White Reindeer. I did a video dedicating this to SGS Films. Again, go check out SGS Films channel. It's very good. He recently passed 100 subscribers. This is a Finnish film about a folk tale about a woman who turns into a white reindeer. This has got stunning cinematography. Like I said in the random review, perhaps a little long, or perhaps it takes a little while to get started, but when it does, it's a beautiful little folk tale. It's kind of a little Finnish Jacques Tourneur. It's got a little bit in common with Cat People. Next is another Eureka Masters of Cinema, Billy Wilder's Witness for the Prosecution, with Tyrone Power, Marlene Dietrich and Charles Laughton, in a fantastic Charles Laughton performance where he plays Charles Laughton. Not my favourite Billy Wilder, but it's so well written, so well acted. It's just an absolute blast. Next is another Eureka Masters of Cinema, which is kind of crazy. It's Wake in Fright by Ted Kotcheff, about a school teacher in Australia who gets lost in the outback. It's fairly nightmarish. Donald Pleasence bizarrely turns up. It's very weird. It's from 1971, so that explains it. Yeah, a really uncomfortable, odd little film with the word cult written all over it. Next is Witness to Murder with George Sanders and Barbara Stanwyck. Again, it's only 83 minutes. Barbara Stanwyck believes she happened to be a witness to George Sanders killing somebody. It's a great wee film. Next is arguably one of the greatest British films of the last 40 years. It's Withnail and I. Arguably the most quotable film of all time. I have a couple of t-shirts myself, advertising the Penrith Tea Rooms. It's arguably the funniest film of all time, even although it has no jokes. It just has so many great lines. Richard E. Grant's first film, and pretty much he's been repeating the same performance throughout his entire career. Paul McGann's fantastic as I. Written by Bruce Robinson, who would never do anything that comes anywhere near close. Fairly autobiographical, as the days of being a poor actor. Richard Griffiths and Ralph Brown are also in it. Just about two unemployed actors who go for a weekend in the country. Again, it's very difficult to talk about plot because the plot is threadbare. Yeah, you just have to see it. It is one of those films that's perfect, but the reason it works is because it does have a heart. Richard E. Grant's Hamlet soliloquy at the end is just heartbreaking, because you know now that he doesn't have I. Withnail's pretty much a dead man walking. Next, it's Willie Dynamite, which I've mentioned quite often in this channel. I hadn't seen it up until a couple of years ago, and it's automatically one of my favourite blaxploitation films. Willie Dynamite is played by Gordon Parks Jr. No, it's not. It's not played by Gordon Parks Jr. Who's it actually played by? I've completely blanked. Roscoe Orman. That doesn't seem right. Roscoe Orman, or the guy from Sesame Street. Bizarrely, he would be on Sesame Street. Willie Dynamite would be a presenter on Sesame Street years later. Obviously without his amazing outfits. But the thing is, despite the terrible things that Willie Dynamite does during the film, the ending is still quite moving. And you still root for him, bizarrely. Again, maybe it's his fashion sense. Yeah, it's just a great blaxploitation. It's so good. Next, as you see, we're on a run of Arrow titles now. Donald Cammell's White of the Eye, which is his serial killer film, but as he made Performance and Wildside, it's Donald Cammell's version of a serial killer film, which is messy and all over the place, but does contain images that are just jaw-dropping, and ideas that are quite fascinating. Perhaps doesn't work in the totality of the piece, but certainly well worth a watch late at night. Next is Massimino Dallamano's What Have They Done to Your Daughters, which isn't the best giallo, but it does have a really good ending, and and it has obviously a crazed killer with a motorcycle helmet and an axe. It does have a socio-political point, which is still relevant today, sadly. Next is What Have You Done to Solange? Another Giallo. Who directed this? Oh, it's Dallamano again. This one's better than What Have You Done to Your Daughters? Because the kind of reveal of what's actually going on is really quite nice. Well, nice is obviously a bit of a stretch. It's about a killer who's preying on the girls of St Mary's Catholic College. And finally, this is an Arrow Academy, Women on the Run. Arrow Academy, like I've mentioned a couple of times, has a couple of really good, almost forgotten about noirs that have been restored. Women on the Run is one, and Too Late for Tears, which again featured in my alphabet of favourite films, the letter T. I did a random review on it, I think. But this one stars Dennis O'Keefe and Anne Sheridan. And again, it's kind of rare as it kind of follows the wife of a criminal who's on the run. Most film noirs and stuff like that would always follow the man, but this one follows the woman because it's women on the run. Again, it's like under an hour and 20 minutes, but it's so economical, so well done, beautifully shot. Granted, I'm biased towards a good noir, but there's a reversible cover, which is slightly more lurid. Arrow Academy have done such a good job. I think the restoration for this one was done by UCLA Film and Television Archive, but really shining a light on these little noirs that I had never heard of. Granted, I'm no expert, but really good, and I would urge you to pick these films up the next Arrow sale or something like that, because it's really, really good. So thanks very much for watching the letter W. Please let me know in the comments which ones I've forgotten about, because chances are I will have forgotten about them, or which ones I should check out, because I won't have seen every single film beginning with the letter W, strangely enough. And hopefully you'll join me for the letter X. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.